Hello and welcome to Comic Culture. I'm Terrence Dollard, a professor in the Department of Mass Communication at the University of North Carolina at Pembroke. My guest today is writer-artist Bob Layton. Bob, welcome to Comic Culture.
Hi, Terrence. How you doing today?
I'm doing well, thank you. So your career has gone back to the 1970s. You are, I guess, best known for your work on Iron Man. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the transition you made. You started your career as an inker. Eventually you do pencils, inks, and writing. So I'm wondering how you made that transition from artist to writer.
My drive was to be a storyteller, period. That's the thing that interested me the most. It just so happened that the people who influenced me, primarily the two mentors that I had in my teens, were both inkers, and at that time there was also a need for that. A need for competent inking or whatever. And I just saw that as the easiest way to get my foot in the door because I wasn't that good of a penciler as I felt I needed to be, but I had enough drawing ability that I could interpret other people's pencil work or whatever. So to me, that seemed like a viable entryway. I mean, my intention was always to do everything. My intention was to conquer the comic book industry if I could. And like I said, I was very fortunate to have two incredible mentors, the late Wally Wood and the late Dick Giordano, that were both mentored me. Woody first, and then Dickie. And as you know, those guys are legends, as I said. So I was extremely fortunate in that degree. So inking was the first step toward working myself up to becoming a triple threat.
You start working with, I'm never sure how to pronounce his name, David...
Let me do it for you. Michelinie.
Michelinie.
Like pickle my knee, yes.
So you start working with him, I believe, on a series before Iron Man, but you're working together on Iron Man. How do you work that collaboration where you're both contributing to the story?
That was step two. I started out as an inker. Then the next thing I did was hook up with a writer who would actually listen to what I had to say, because I was always a fountain of ideas. When I was 11 years old, I wrote this on notebook paper. I drew it. Doomquest, I drew it all out. I wish I could have kept that. Can you imagine, Terrence, if I had kept that thing now? It'd be like, the world's greatest collector's item. I was always a fountain of ideas, and David was kind enough to actually listen to them. He's like, these are viable ideas, and we started our collaborative effort of co-plotting stories together at DC on a book called Star Hunters, which was very short-lived. But we also had a pretty good feeling that DC was going to cut back their line and get rid of all the fledgling writers and inkers and pencilers and stuff like that. And I had worked at Marvel previously. And my suggestion to David was, let's go over there now while the getting is good and try to land a series there together. And so we went over and we interviewed, and their policy was at that time, they because everything was on the newsstand, so they would have to sign 12-month deals with the distribution newsstand distributors, basically the mafia. They would you're laughing because it's true, right? So they would sign, but for 12 months, if they were doing the Avengers, it was a contract for 12 months to distribute the Avengers. Well, when they got the numbers back and they saw a book was in a cancellation range, they would take Don Buscema off, or they would take, John Romita off, or they would take Jack Kirby off, and they would put schmucks like us on to basically run out the series, and that way that we would get a little trial to see if we were any good or not. And I remember there were 3 books they offered us, and David never read Marvel comics. He wasn't a Marvel guy. He was always a DC guy. And one of them was Iron Man, and I'm like, Iron Man, we want Iron Man. I just said, because my whole childhood, I always thought that book was ghastly. It was just awful. It was the redheaded stepchild of Marvel. It was like nobody ever loved it. And I so wanted to get my hands on it because I had a million ideas for it. So we wound up getting it. So he and I sat down and we pretty much just reinvented it. They gave us carte blanche because they were going to cancel the book. So they gave us carte blanche to do whatever we wanted. You know, it kind of made, can we make some changes? Is it okay? You know, and we, as you know, we did. And the next thing you know, 6 months later, it's one of Marvel's top selling books. And the rest was history. You know, lightning in a bottle, my friend.
Now, speaking of in a bottle, you are responsible for the Demon in a Bottle story, which Marvel has sort of taken as canon. Tony Stark is an alcoholic, and we see that in the film. So when you see something like this, most people are expected to return their characters the way they got them, and yet you were able to make a lasting change to a character.
Well, that was one of the criteria I had for changing the entire series. You know, it's so funny because you know, Demon in a Bottle was Robert Downey's favorite Marvel comic. That was the one that motivated him to want to play Tony Stark. You know, but it's way too dark for them to ever do as a film. You know, I mean, it's just that's just not what Marvel Studios does. But for us, it was a real simple matter. They had always used the heart problem. You know, it's like the shrapnel and the heart thing, you know, from Boo. All the various writers that had done the book had always just played that to death. And and let's face it, Terrence, I don't know anyone who's had 50 heart attacks and lived other than Dick Cheney. Okay, I mean, you know, it's like. And he was every issue as a kid. I remember he just about to beat Ultimo or just about to beat the Unicorn, and he would have a heart attack and keel over, right? And it's like, even in the early 1970s or the mid 1970s, heart transplants were commonplace, you know, and Jarvik artificial hearts and whatever. Plus, we're talking about the world's greatest engineer. He could have probably figured out a way to fix his heart by now. So we thought that we were creating this great corporate world for him now. We were trying to, you know, this was the milieu which this character was going to grow and evolve. Something they had pretty much just, you know, thrown away, but we really wanted to embrace that whole world of corporate intrigue. So having him succumb to something like a corporate disease, like cocaine addiction or alcoholism or whatever, seemed like a logical internal struggle for him, rather than it just be something external like, you know, Heart Attack of the Month Club. So that, you know, that was part of the motivation. And somehow along the way, I have become the unofficial spokesperson for comic book sobriety now. 40 years later, I mean, the conventions, I still get letters from people who said, I'm struggling with alcohol and drugs, and I have a copy. There was a sailor who sent me a letter about a year ago who had a copy of Demon in a Bottle at his bunk, framed, and he on his ship. And he said he kept that up there to remind him, you know, because he has a wife and kids at home, and he didn't want, you know, didn't want to fall back into his habits or whatever. A few years ago, they did a survey on comic book resources, which is, you know, the largest a website or whatever, and they voted it one of the top 20 comic book stories of all time, which you never know when you're doing it. Nobody ever sets out to make history, you know, it just happens. It, like I said, lightning in a bottle again. We just happened to be in the right place at the right time, reflecting what was happening in society. Because at that time, people were starting to talk about drug and alcohol addiction. I remember Betty Ford Clinic opened up. You know, it was something that people were talking about. And comics are always a mirror to what's happening in popular culture or in society. You know, the egomaniacs amongst us will say, well, we're the innovators, we create all this stuff. No, we really are mirrors that we reflect what's going on in the world in a fantasy context.
Now, you mentioned the internal struggle, Tony's battle with the bottle. And in many ways, that becomes more important than the villain of the month. So I'm wondering how you're able to look at a character and look at, essentially, every story is going to feature Iron Man fighting the bad guy, struggling, eventually winning. But there's that internal struggle that is what makes those stories interesting. I'm just wondering what your thought is on that.
Well, that's exactly my point. That's something that he will struggle with the rest of his life, and he'll be tested. And it's like, I know about these things. I've had personal experience with these things, and it's like, to me, it seemed like that battle is part of what makes him heroic. Besides the fact that he, obviously he's somebody who has been inexorably changed by the conflicts in his life, and this, like I said, this sword of Damocles is always hanging over his head. I think it's the thing that drives him to do good. I think it's the thing that drives him to make amends. To me, it was like it became an integral part of who he is as a person, and I just think it humanized him. The difference was in the old days, and I know this because I had to go back and write the foreword to the Tales of Suspense omnibus book, and I had to go back and read all the original Iron Man, which weren't written by Stan Lee, by the way. People forget about that. Stan came up with the idea and gave it to his brother, Larry Lieber. And Larry Lieber was no Stan Lee, okay? And the early stories were just ghastly. I mean, it was total dross. And so, like I said, he never really got a chance to evolve. It was always the Tony Stark and Stark Industries was a means to an end, just to get him into the armor so he could fight bad guys, And as a kid, I'm sitting going, I'd rather be Tony Stark than Iron Man, dude. I mean, these guys, good looking. He's got all the toys. He's got all the money. He's the smartest guy in the room, no matter where he goes. What 14 or 15-year-old boy doesn't fantasize about that? It seemed to me like in order to make the character credible, you had to make the man credible. And that's what they failed to do up to that point. That's the trick to the success of our Iron Man, and how it's continued for 40 years here is because it was about him, and the alcoholism is part of that.
Another thing that you did, going back to those older comics, when you look at the way Iron Man was portrayed, that Kirby style at Marvel, where you had the squiggly lines that indicated something shiny, or maybe a Joe Sinnott would kind of do some feathering. Your visualization of Iron Man, you made the armor look shiny. And I'm wondering how you achieved that technique, how that epiphany came upon you, and how, I guess you were able to do that every month.
It's not an epiphany. It's all about the massive amount of indoctrination I had as a child. I grew up reading the Arthurian legends, knights. Two things we can thank: King Arthur and Ed Big Daddy Roth. Okay, because I like to draw hot rods too when I was a kid. Okay, and Ed Big Daddy Roth was one of the great hot rod designers, however, like that, and he used to do the weirdos and all that kind of stuff. So it was an affection for the Arthurian tales, and it always seemed to me that Tony Stark was a modern day analog. He was this tortured king, like Arthur. He had a kingdom, which was Stark Industries, a global kingdom. There were knights around him, the Avengers. All those things led me to led me to start thinking about him as a knight, and also the fact that I liked drawing cards, and he was a machine. And I remember artists, they used to draw his boot cuffs, and they'd actually have them swaying and have folds in them, like they were like buccaneer boots or something, And I was always a science buff. I mean, you go right now, go in my bathroom, you're not going to see a pile of comics on the back of my toilet. You're going to see Scientific American, okay? I was always a science buff. To me, it's another part of making Iron Man the character I always envisioned, was making the science credible, making him look like a machine, making that armor look badass and shiny and everything that you would expect. It was, so I don't know if it was a revelation so much as just the way I saw things. And I remember Dick Giordano used to trained me as an inker in saying that the tool defines the object. So if you're drawing a car, you draft it, because every car that comes out of Detroit is exactly the same. Why is it? It's because it's done with math. It's done. It's drafted. It's hardlined, right? It has hard edges. It has specific mathematics to it. So I just applied those same principles when I did Iron Man. The stuff that doesn't move got templated and ruled and used with a pen, a hard line, as opposed to the parts that were organic. That was the trick to creating metal. It was just the way I was kind of taught.
I will point out that whenever I try and draw metal, I'm aping your style as much as I can, especially when you've got the concentric, dollops of light that sort of go across something metallic.
That's part of metal too. Metal always has more than one light source as opposed to human beings. I mean, we're looking at each other right now. You pretty much guess where our light sources are, but metal picks up light sources from more. It has a primary and a secondary light source, and you can play with that. You can use that. The fact, I just took a little white out and dabbed in like little blips of light, little lens flares, whatever. That was just part of, to me, making it look cool. Because, we want our superheroes to be cool, don't we? Professor, that's what we want.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then, of course, as soon as you do that, it seems like everyone sort of catches that and realizes that that's a great way to make the costumes of different armored heroes look that way. But you end up moving into penciling. I think you started working on the Hercules series. So how do you pitch that series? How do you get 4 issues, I think it was 4 issues, to tell the story of a character who nobody really knows?
Well, again, people ask, well, why did I leave Iron Man at the height of his success? I mean, when my first run, the book was it was a bestseller. It was in Marvel's top 10, and I left. And people asked why, and it was because, as I explained in the beginning of this program, I had goals. And the next goal was I felt that thanks to David, I had learned all the basics I needed to know in terms of script wordsmithing, scripting and plotting and whatever like that. And it was time for me to go solo. It's like, leave the band and go out and do a solo album. I wanted to be a writer, and Iron Man already had a writer, so it's like not like I could take over the book or something. I'd have to kill David. So what happened was I had heard that Marvel was going to attempt to do the very first miniseries in comics. The idea of an open and closed story, which I'm fond of, actually, more so than episodic comics. Okay, so I came up with the idea because in the old Thor books, back when I was a kid, every so often, like once every couple of years, Hercules would come to New York, get drunk, and beat Thor up for no particular reason. It just seemed to me like he was a total ass, but I always kind of loved, because he always had this big, grin on his face, and it's like, forsooth, and I don't know why they spoke Shakespearean, but and basically he'd look around for someone to beat up, and he'd smack Thor in the head or something. It's like, and then they would trade hands for 15 pages or something. But I love those characters that were discarded, secondary characters, those guys, and that always made an impression on me. And at that particular time, as this was like the late 70s, Star Wars had just come out. And I was, and I'm looking around at the Marvel Universe, and it's so dark. We're guilty of it too. We were doing Demon in a Bottle, and the X-Men were doing Days of Future Past, and all the X-Men are like dying and all this kind of stuff. And Frank Miller is doing Daredevil, which is incredibly dark and all this stuff. And I loved comedies, romantic comedies specifically, but and I really thought that it's time to do something that's just fun. So I love the idea of dealing with a rite of passage, adolescent rite of passage with a guy who's 5,000 years old, you know, who has a tendency to drink and party too much and stick his nose where it doesn't belong. So the whole idea of taking Hercules and putting him out into the galactic Marvel universe, as opposed to just having him come on Earth and beat up Thor, you know, whatever, and forcing him to grow up a little bit, you know, forcing him to see, you know, look at himself differently, forcing him to be confronted by beings much more powerful than himself. Seemed like a good idea. So I went in and I pitched the idea. You know, it's like, yeah, he's going to be drunk through most of it. And there'll be a lot of betting of women, and at the end, he's going to have a drinking match with Galactus, and and they're kind of like, okay, just don't mess it up. So they really didn't give me a hard time about it. You know, I think I presented it in a manner that made them laugh, and they figure, well, if I can put that on paper, fine. And thus began the very first Marvel miniseries, which I beat Frank Miller by 2 weeks with Wolverine. I got out with Hercules, Prince of Power. So, and it was so successful that they immediately came back and asked me to do a second miniseries. So, you know, so that kept me busy for years. I went and did that, and then I went back and did the second miniseries, and that did so well, I did the Hercules graphic novel after that. So Hercules was off and on kept me busy, along with all the other projects I did there, because by then I was on contract. They kept me busy there pretty much for the next 10, 12 years.
And it seemed like whenever they needed a sharp cover, or if they needed someone to help out a penciler who might not be the best, they seemed to contact you and have you fill that role. As I mentioned to you in an email, the first Marvel comic that I really got into was Secret Wars #4, which you were doing the pencils on. And
I got drafted.
And it's because Mike Zeck was doing the book, and there were your pencils in there. So it seemed like they used you as that sort of go-to.
Well, you ever notice from that era, you'll see that I did about 7 or 8 covers a month. I became one of their premier cover artists at Marvel. And that was not by accident. And I'm going to confess this to you, okay, Professor? The reason why was I lived a block away from Marvel. My apartment was right over, I mean, literally like a block and a half from the offices at the time. And so when John Romita needed something done overnight, he would send an intern over to my apartment. They would slide a manila envelope under the door, and it would be like either a sketch or a pencil cover or something like that with a Post-it on it, say, can we have this by tomorrow by 3 o'clock or whatever. So one of the things that helped my success and helped my name get out there was the fact that just by sheer coincidence, I became Marvel's after-hours art annex. So that's in the case of Secret Wars, I was on contract to Marvel, so that meant that I was required to do X amount of pages every month. And I was in between miniseries. In fact, at the time with Secret Wars, I was developing a new Power Man and Iron Fist series. I was going to do a revamp the way I did with Iron Man, with Power Man and Iron Fist, me and Dennis Cowan, who were like best buds at the time. And Dennis Cowan was a black belt martial artist himself, and we were going to take it down a whole new direction. So I was working on development with that when I got the call, basically saying that Zeck, you know, is under the gun, and you're drafted. So I got drafted. That's what I say, because I'm on contract and I have to fulfill my obligations. So I was the guy who was available. So, you know, it wasn't like, you know, one of those things where they came and got me because, like I said, I was the warmest body around that had time on their hands.
Well, I see that we have about 3 minutes left, and I feel like I need to ask.
Fast.
I know.
We haven't even talked about Valiant or anything, you know.
That's what I was going to ask you about. I mean, you end up becoming an editor and editor-in-chief, I believe, at Valiant Comics, and I'm wondering how you make that sort of administrative role as vital to you as the creative role.
Did I not mention to you early in this that I intended to do everything? I did.
You did.
And yeah, editor and editor-in-chief and all that was, again, and this goes back to Dick Giordano. Okay, Dickie I had known since I was a young teenager. I put on the very first, I grew up in Indiana, put on the very first convention in Indiana in 1975, and one of my first guests there was Dick Giordano. So, and I worship Dickie like a god. He was like amazing. But Dickie was not only amazing penciler and inker and editor, he was a businessman, a very sharp businessman. I mean, he and Neil ran Continuity Studios for a long time there, and they did tons of ad work as well as some incredible comics. And Dickie always inculcated into me that the guy that can do everything is the guy that keeps working. And he goes, if you're going to be in this business, you need to learn every aspect of the business. When I worked at Marvel, I used to go up to the 11th floor, which was unheard of. That's where accounting was and legal. And I used to talk to the gals up there, and I'd find out how the P&Ls work. I mean, with the profit and loss margins, everything is on comics. Like who prints them? It's like what kind of money does the company make? I started teaching myself all this. So I wanted to know everything there was, so that when the time came that I had a chance to actually participate in what I created, I jumped on it. And Valiant wound up being the third largest publisher in the United States. So that was a great moment for me. It's like Valiant was an amazing place to be. You can tell because it's been 25 years, and most of us still keep in touch with each other. It's like it was a great time.
On top of that, the characters themselves are still, because you were able to create dynamic characters that the audience is connected with, they're still being published today.
Yeah, and they're on their way to becoming movies at Sony too. It's like I won't get any money for that either. Okay, I don't get anything for the Iron Man. I won't. That's okay. When I sold the company, I got plenty of money. Okay, so Dinesh, feel free, have a good time, make great pictures. Just I get my credit. It's like it's exciting. Iron Man and Valiant are the two legacies I think I've left behind in comics that endure, and I'm very proud of that.
Well, Bob, I'm afraid we're going to have to stop there because we've run out of time. I'd like to thank you so much for joining me today. I'd like to thank you at home for watching Comic Culture. We'll see you again soon.